The title for our presentation today is How to Recalibrate Project Schedules and Support Owners' Strategic Decision-Making in these uncertain times of COVID-19. So my name is Arvelo. I'm a Managing Director with PMA here in the Boston office. I have 20 plus years of experience providing project management, project controls, planning and scheduling services for clients in multiple industries. I think we can all relate to the impacts that pretty much every project experienced last spring due to COVID-19. So in today's presentation, Dennis and I will discuss how we leverage the different tools and techniques, some of which have been covered throughout the conference here in the last couple of days, to support one of our largest projects here in Boston. I mean, we will talk about the approach we took to understand how these changes impacted the project, how COVID impacted the project, how the team came together to collaborate, to recalibrate the plan, to understand, what's a plan moving forward, but also to understand what other uncertainty was there in the schedule, in the program, right? I mean, obviously this was all new to everybody, so we wanted to make sure that we had a good eyesight of what's coming towards us and helping the owner and ultimately the team move forward and make smart decisions and based on actual data. So that's the goal for today. With that, I'll pass it on to Dennis.
Great. Thanks, Angel. Appreciate the introduction. Very excited to be here today. I think this is a really great topic and certainly interesting to deal with changes like such as COVID, but the future's full of changes that we don't expect. So hopefully we can apply this to our next change management process going forward. So I'm also a managing director here in the Boston office. I've been here for over 20 years, helping to lead and manage the project controls team. Have a strong background in schedule and happy to share some of that today. So let's walk you through our agenda for the day. Again, I won't read every bullet point, but we'll hit a little bit on our project background. We have an interesting kind of case study to present today and how we utilize these tools on that. Our first step was our approach. How do we figure out how to attack this problem? Understand what has happened and how the project had been or hadn't been impacted at that date. We then go through a kind of a recalibration to understand what changes meant to the project. Second half of the presentation, we'll be talking about factoring uncertainty, and this is about the risk component of our approach. And then finally, packaging information, presenting information in a manner that allows for smart decision making. So we will save time at the end for Q&A, and like other presentations that I hope you had a chance to attend in the last couple of days, you can utilize the chat feature if you'd like to submit a question throughout the presentation or at the end. So, all right, so let's jump right into our project and case study. So our project that we're going to be talking about today was the Boston Arts Academy. PMA was selected as the owner's project manager for this project. The Boston Arts Academy was established in 1988 in the city of Boston by those who recognized the need for an arts academy inside the city. Started off, its first home was in a 100-year-old warehouse across the street from Fenway Park, the back entrance to Fenway Park, where there's lots of logistical space. Almost immediately there were space constraints and inadequate facilities that drove them to the decision to start to find a new home. And that home is what we're seeing here, a rendition of it. $125 million project. As with any school job, there was tight schedule constraints, certainly about when the job could start, which was driven by the calendar year, the school calendar year, I should say, but also on the completion. Can we get the project done in time for students to return? Really interesting site, again, across from Fenway Park, limited to no laydown area, picking off the streets, lots of tight challenges, not only a neighboring neighborhood, but neighboring projects that needed to be coordinated with as well. For those who've worked on schools in recent years, lots of great added educational programs and facilities that have come about. And as you can probably imagine, for an arts academy, really unique spaces in terms of dance and visual art, working spaces and performance spaces, and and studios and whatnot. This did have a couple neat elements like a roof terrace and a 500-seat auditorium and some STEM labs. So this would be the home to the 450 artist scholars that call Boston Arts Academy their home. So if you've been to Boston, the downtown area is in the back of the picture, and this is Fenway Park, and our project was right across the street there. So one of the first things we wanted to do to understand before we got into the analysis and deeper dive into the schedule was understand the project goals. Two of the top goals were about cost and schedule. As we mentioned before, school calendar drives a lot of this stuff, and knowing that we had a project to hand over was going to be a key decision in this process. And then, as this was a public project with fixed available funding, knowing that we had a fixed budget and knowing that acceleration or use of contingency could be a factor, we'd have to be creative in solutions as we propose them. So safety protocols is always important on a project, but as you can imagine, the COVID factor amped it up a little bit. So that was a true important goal on this project. And then finally, transparency. With one of the driving goals behind this entire effort was to present the right information to the project team so they can make decisions in a timely manner. So we wanted to be transparent with the information that we had, whether that was about the known impacts or the future anticipated impacts. So we'll walk you guys through that process. Another quick introduction in terms of the project timeline. So again, school was founded in 1988. And about 20 years later, they realized that they really did need new facilities. The Mass School Building Authority and the City of Boston gave approval in December of 17, which allowed design to start. That ended up with a groundbreaking ceremony and the start of demolition work in December of 18. Design process continued, and construction documents and GMP pricing happened in the spring and summer of 19. Allowing us to get a full buyout of trade packages in August. The important part about this is all of this was prior to COVID, right? We had a full building permit prior to COVID. We had construction starting and underway prior to COVID. And then, as we all know, unfortunately in March of 20, the United States and the Boston market was impacted by a COVID shutdown. It was in late March, where not only the city of Boston, but state of Massachusetts had some sort of restrictions in place on non-essential construction. So that lasted in some sort of regard until May of 2020, where some sort of work resumed. And it is approximately around that time that the PMA OPM team started a schedule risk assessment, of which Angel and I participated in. So at that time, the project was planned to be complete in the fall of 21. And hopefully what we can show in this analysis here is where we arrived and what information we brought forth to the table to indicate if we should reforecast that completion date. Okay, so here we are again in the March, April, May timeframe of 2020, and the world entered into a whole new state of change. Project planning and project execution was challenged from every direction. And there was a lot of projects that were shut down, and a lot of projects that had a lot of gating issues such as these about when things could proceed and how they could proceed. So for example, safety protocols. You might have all heard different enhanced PPE and temperature checks and screenings. How would that affect the job? Would that be a short-term or a long-term thing? Social distancing restrictions, whether you had multiple people working in areas that now needed to spread out or have less people on staff, less people in the area. The shutdown certainly impacted our schedule directly. We might have had weather work that was contemplated for good weather that is now being shifted into a poor weather conditions. The remobilization time period required. The fact that potentially revised delivery dates, long leads might have been slipped because of fabrication facility shut down or because of government restrictions. And at this point, it was unclear when the return was occurring what our manpower availability would be, whether we would go through cycles of short or long-term unavailability of staff. In general, the Boston market was good, and there was a real fear that there would be run on quality manpower if half the manpower was out on COVID illness. So productivity impacts related to those two items, right? Or if less people can be on site, or if there's restrictions, how did that play into our new territory here? And then also the threat of another potential shutdown. Was there a chance that the project would be partially or not permanently, but fully impacted with a complete shutdown for some period of time? All these things in the May of 2020 period were unknowns. So what was our approach to handle this? We kind of took a four-prong approach. First was to understand the current schedule, get a good understanding of where things stood. Second was to factor in changes, the new conditions, and establish a new base plan going forward. We're going to dive into each of these on the next slide, so I'm going to cover these very quickly here. On the second half of our presentation, Angel's going to walk us through items 3 and 4, which is developing a risk register and trying to model that uncertainty. And even today, here we are on the back end of COVID, but there's still uncertainty in the future about COVID and when life will return to our somewhat normal conditions. And then finally, again, how do we package this information up and share it so that smart decisions can be made? Okay, so step 1, reviewing that project schedule. The contractor and the design team and the overall team had a great foundation for a schedule. They had a very detailed 3,000 activity CPM Primavera schedule, very strong execution schedule that guided the team through the project. However, we wanted to make sure that just not the project construction scheduler was aware about the key constraints and the approaches and the work restrictions, but that the project team had an education on where things stood. So one of the first things we did was kind of revisit that. And if you think about a pyramid of how this process would work, we wanted a very strong foundation to enable understanding of how the schedule was supposed to be impacted, which was our next step. So we were 6 or 8 weeks into the COVID impact, and we were dealing with different parameters that we just showed on a couple of slides back, and we needed to recalibrate our schedule. We did know that some things would be later. We did know that some deliveries would be impacted. And this was our opportunity to update to the current date from a schedule that hadn't been updated since the project was shut down. So this was also our opportunity to start further collaborating with the team. I think at this point, everyone was in a very virtual environment, and it was a challenge to conduct interactive planning sessions through that. But I think we found a couple of benefits that we can share with you on a slide or two about how we made that happen. So again, this step here was about furthering that foundation and bringing the plan to be current. However, that did leave the remaining unknown future project risks unaddressed, and that's where we tackled this in this third step, qualitative and quantitative risk assessments. So we continued our interactive planning sessions. We identified project risks. We worked with the project teams. And again, this wasn't a one voice from a CM. This was all voices, all parties at the table to find out what would impact the schedule, what could impact the schedule, assign risk owners, assign mitigation steps. I don't want to go into too deep here because Angel's going to spend a moment or two walking us through this later. And then the last step is what do we do with all this great data? We probably had several interactive planning sessions with representation from construction managers, designers, project team, and owners project team. And a lot of great information and thought was gathered. And how did that get packaged so that it could be presented to help people's gut feel about the project be quantified? So we have some examples of that. All right, so I'm going to dive deep into the how we recalibrated our plan in just a couple slides here before I turn it over to Angel. So we needed to understand that pre-impacted plan. As I said prior, the construction manager had a 3,000 activity P6 schedule. And I think if you referenced some of our earlier NetPoint conference seminars from yesterday and today, this was probably a level 4 schedule, level 3 schedule, very detailed, an execution schedule, not a strategy schedule. But it served its purpose. It was there to serve its purpose of how we execute on construction. This was last updated 2 weeks prior to the shutdown, and then the project shut down for part of March and into May, April and May. So again, we wanted to recap with the team, what were the drivers for this? We worked through some of the items listed here and had a nice, clear understanding through our working sessions of what the critical and near critical path were. It was at this point that we wanted to move the schedule into NetPoint. As you heard before, this does allow for more of a strategic look, and it helps some of the non-schedulers understand the nuance of the schedule and see the big picture as a whole. So at this point, we transitioned the schedule from P6 into NetPoint. As you probably heard in Guy's keynote earlier today, the team is working on schedule density, and having one schedule that serves the purpose of level 1, level 2, and all the way down to level 3 and level 4 scheduling. We're not there yet, so we had to do this process manually. So we took the 3,000 activity schedule in P6 and made a model of it in NetPoint. And this is the portion where we made that transition. So it was this time that we were able to work with the team. We collaborated and kind of made them understand how we impact the schedule. People were agreeing on what the impacts were. And again, we didn't want this to be an Arvelo or a Dennis tool. We wanted this to be a team tool, which is why through interactive planning sessions, we kind of got a consensus across the board. I'd like to part with 2 neat examples that we kind of use technology on in the virtual world here. We held a lot of our interactive planning sessions through Microsoft Teams. That allows multi-user interface. I don't know if people have used this in the past, but in this simple example here, we have a scenario where after further investigation and study, some of the activities we found cannot meet the initial original duration and had to be adjusted. But because we had players at the table, they were able to make adjustments. Here you can see process B as being recovered to keep our project on schedule. This real-time collaboration was really important during this process of updating the plan and impacting the plan. We had lots of people in there playing around, moving the model, and gaining kind of an understanding because of that real-time feedback loop. So, and then finally, I just wanted to demonstrate an example of our 150 activity NetPoint file. Again, boiled this down, but this shows the example of how we kind of boil the activities down, keeping the same behavior as our P6 schedule, and the same critical and near critical paths. Organize this in terms of swim lanes and color coding. But as you can see, it's easier to understand a 1-page schedule file as opposed to 40 to 50 pages of detailed 3,000 activities. And the nice thing about this is this was the foundation for our schedule risk assessment. This was the last step that we needed before we could start thinking about qualitative and quantitative risks. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Angel, who can guide us through the rest of the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis.
There you go.
All right, so factor uncertainty. So Dennis just walked us through the process of understanding what the schedule was before the impacts, and then also to understand what happened during the shutdown and how the team came together to recalibrate and to collaborate to define what's the best path moving forward and what would be the best execution plan. But the reality here is that we just came out of the shutdown. Here we are, May, June last year, and a lot of people had a lot of questions. So what now? I mean, a lot of questions were unanswered. We were here coming out of a pandemic situation, so uncharted territory, a lot of uncertainty in our hands. we really needed to understand what were the possible outcomes of this, where we were heading. I mean, we had we have to answer some or at least trying to find answers to some of major questions. You know, what are the major risks affecting the project moving forward? What's the probability of meeting our original target dates? What can we do to mitigate these risks? You know, can we bring it back to where we want it? At what price? Is it worth trying to do that or not? I mean, we got to be realistic here too. So we wanted to understand really where we were standing and where we were heading moving forward, and ultimately make sure that everybody was on the same page and kind of you know, executing to the same strategy. So, you know, Dennis talked about the new conditions, right? I mean, we need to acknowledge that the world from that point on was not going to be the same. We need to deal with some new safety protocols, temperature checks, screening, you name it, social distancing, and limited med power. You know, we had some trades that didn't want to go back, you know, didn't want to go back to the job site because it didn't feel safe. Some others just didn't want to come back. I mean, we were really worried about getting the right people. Obviously, that brings some productivity impacts. You know, we have some enhanced cleaning to think about. We have, you know, to hand over areas from contractor A to contractor B. Now we need to worry about some additional stuff that we didn't have to worry about a few months ago. Dennis talked about schedule changes. You know, these represent some threats, right? With some work that was probably original plan for the fall, now slipping into the winter, but also some opportunities. I mean, maybe so some work that was originally planned for the winter now slipping into spring. Could that be an opportunity? That, you know, we'll take those too. And, you know, and one thing that everybody was worried about at the time, I think, you know, again, this was new to everybody, was the possibility of a new shutdown, right? What would it happen to the project if this happens again? You know, what's the impact of that? You know, how do we deal with that? So we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. This is a highly visible project, Heart of Boston, very important to the community. So we definitely wanted to have data. We wanted to have the right tools to help the team, help the owner answer some of these questions and really tailor the strategy accordingly. So, you know, we went through a qualitative and quantitative risk assessment to factor in all this uncertainty. Here in this slide, you can see our typical SRA process, right? We start with a qualitative risk analysis where we review and update the schedule, kind of what Dennis just walked us through. And then we go through a risk identification process where we kind of identify top risk, we rank them, we come up with qualitative ratings and things like that, and eventually end up with a risk register. But we also wanted to take it to the next step and really quantify this risk. We wanted to go through a quantitative risk analysis. We wanted to know what are the probabilities, or what are the chances of meeting the regional target dates? What's the distribution? I mean, are we just taking a hit and staying within the same range, or are there other factors bringing noise to the schedule, if you will? So we wanted to truly understand that. So we went through a process of modeling, of ranging, of simulating, and then summarizing results and running what-if scenarios, which we'll just talk about in a second. So the first step, right? I mean, the first step through our qualitative analysis to really understand the risk appetite for this project. So we spend, you know, quality time with the project key stakeholders to understand what their appetite was, to kind of generate the heat map that we can use for qualitative analysis. Obviously, you know, we are in a remote situation here, so we had to get creative. We had to leverage, you know, MS Teams, Zoom, you name it, way to engage different stakeholders. Some people were on the site, some people were remote, some people were remote in a different time zone. So we had to be flexible. We had to make sure that, you know, we engage the right people. I mean, as Dennis mentioned through his presentation, that the last thing we wanted to do was to, you know, give the perception that this was us coming in and dictating the team how to do stuff and what the path is for them is to be moving forward. We wanted to make sure that this was really a team approach, that the information we gathered and the results we get were really a result of a team effort, not just, you know, an external party coming in and dictating guidance to the project. So we started this process with sending out a questionnaire. So we engaged the key stakeholders. We had representation from all the key areas, you know, from from procurement, from engineering, from the owner's side, from the construction management side, for the superintendent, the guys in the field, the scheduler, the OPM team. So we wanted to make sure that everybody had a seat on the table. Again, nobody's voice was louder than anybody else's. So we sent out this questionnaire for people to fill in, to provide, to rank their top risks, things that they have in their head, things that keep them awake at night, and rank their top five threats and opportunities, and provide that feedback anonymously. So again, that's that guarantees getting the feedback from everybody here. So we took that information then, and we consolidated. We made sure we reviewed information. Obviously, we found some common patterns, some common risk threats and opportunities that were identified by project team members. We grouped them, we ranked them. Then we brought them back to the project team and brainstormed about it, making sure that we were not missing anything. And also we started talking about mitigation strategies, right? So now that we identified the top risk, who are the owners, who are the managers for that risk, what can we do about it to minimize impacts or to maximize opportunities. But ultimately, we were also preparing for a qualitative analysis, for a quantitative analysis. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So we were preparing for a quantitative analysis. So we wanted to make sure that we had a strategy to model each one of these risks. In a traditional, schedule risk assessment effort, for the most part, the top risk in your risk register come to your risk assessment, quantitative risk assessment as risk drivers. But in this case, we have very unique risks, right? Risks that we have never dealt with, and we wanted to make sure that we had the right approach to model each scenario, to model basically every concern people had in their mind, or the team agreed to model. So we defined a strategy to either tackle this risk as traditionally as risk drivers, or if it was a consideration to maybe incorporate some of this as part of the duration ranges, or maybe some of these were so fundamentally different that it would be better off modeled as a completely different scenario, as a what-if scenario. And the perfect example of that is the probability or the chances of having a second shutdown. I mean, if you think about the variability that we introduced in the schedule coming out of a risk driver, or the variability we introduced to the schedule given the inherent activity duration variability, it would be all just completely opaque by a 2, 3, 4 month shutdown. We wanted to make sure that we were able to dissect these risks basically almost one at a time to really understand what was the compounded effect of these risks, rather than to deal with a 3 month, 4 month impact that would just water down everything else. So we defined strategies of how to tackle how to model this in different steps to really understand what could be the outcome if those were to happen. So obviously, as part of this process and finalizing the qualitative analysis, we established the project register, where we kind of listed the risk drivers. We had the probability and the impact of those, and we ended up with a qualitative rating coming out of that heat map that we talked about earlier. That led us to our quantitative analysis. So now we have an idea of what the major risks could be moving forward. What are people worried about? But we really wanted to understand what quantified, what could really be the impacts of this. What does it mean to our dates? What does it mean to our target? Again, is it worth trying to bring it back? Is it worth trying to throw resources, money, time, effort to bring them back? Or is it just a better strategy to kind of calibrate a plan and pull from the same direction? So we wanted to make sure that we analyze that and provide the right feedback. So obviously we had a lot of tools available to us. We could have gone through some multiple engines that would allow us to do the Monte Carlo simulations, but given the nature of this exercise, the fact that we really, it was very important to us to engage everyone in the process, schedulers and non-schedulers alike, people who have gone through this risk process before, probably people who it was the first time they were hearing about it. The fact that, as Dennis just pointed out, we took the 3,000 CPM schedule and we created a model that behaved the same way that we can use for a risk assessment in NetPoint. So we just landed that NetRisk was just the natural environment to do this. It was the right tool to do this. NetRisk allows the team, ultimately the user, to enter data entry very easily. To go through your risk drivers, to your range and durations, to put durations and variability in fairly easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's very transparent. People understand the process. So again, it wasn't just us having a session and then bringing that information back and kind of create our own model. We were creating the model as we go along, and people were engaged throughout the process. We also wanted to make sure that people, again, understand the process, and people understood what were the different scenarios we were trying to make, and ultimately we wanted to make sure that people understood the results. So we'll get to that in a second, where we can see, the outcome, the output of the NetRisk simulations are pretty neat graphs that are fairly easy to understand by everyone. It also has the capability of syncing to Excel, so we have the flexibility of massaging them if needed. So then you want to go back one slide, Dennis? Sorry. So basically that took us to our risk register, right? So we talked about reviewing the risk drivers. Now we assign actual probability a number. We assign a number for the variability in the durations. We can do this either as net days being added or subtracted, or as a percentage. Having that flexibility was super helpful for some people in the team. Some people in the field, it was easier for them to understand the concept, maybe as a percentage rise rather than adding days here and there. We also talked about assigning risk drivers to activities, correlations. I added variability and things like that, but also we were able to model different scenarios. So we talked about productivity impacts. That productivity impact by itself was unknown. I mean, the project team coming out of the shutdown, for the first week or two, they experienced about 1 hour a day of lost time due to temperature checks and cleaning and additional coordination due to the new protocols. And the reality was, we didn't know if this was going to be the new norm moving forward, or if this was going to eventually be reduced to something else. So we talked about, should we model 1 hour a day? Should we model, half an hour a day? How should we model this as a short term? Should we model this as a long term? So NetRisk allows you to kind of model all these different scenarios and give you that flexibility to really kind of come up with results that answer some of those questions. Manpower availability, logistic impacts. I mean, we talked about the threats of NetPoint, right? I mean, maybe the crews cannot flow through the building the way they originally wanted, but it also brings some opportunities. I mean, the fact that there were no bowl games, there were no 45,000 people walking in front of the site every couple of days, gave them some additional freedom for deliveries, to pickups, for logistic purposes. So that's also another opportunity that we wanted to model. Then we get into the non-working period. So we talked about the push in the schedule due to the lockdown. Obviously, that pushed something into winter and some winter work into spring. We wanted to make sure that the schedules were the weather was modeled the proper way. So that the non-working period weather module in NetRisk allows us to do that. Well, we also wanted to model what could be the impacts of reduced working shifts. So some of the trades were originally planned to work on a 6-day a week shift, and due to these new protocols, some of them were restricted to 5 days a week. And again, we just didn't know exactly for how long, but we wanted to model that. So we talked about short-term, long-term, high variability, low variability, shorter working periods, weather. And the reality is, full disclosure, we did not modeling every single combination. That would have been an enormous task. We just decided on which ones were the more realistic, the ones that the team were really keen to understand. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, with the combination of NetPoint and NetRisk, we were always able to kind of figure out a way of how to model that scenario. So we did not discard, or we didn't model a scenario because the software did not allow it. The flexibility that the risk drivers, the duration ranges, the non-working periods, the weather functions brings to the table allow us to basically have a solution of how to model pretty much every scenario that was thrown at us. And then, again, some of them were decided not to be modeled, but it wasn't because of software limitations. So having that peace of mind was great for us. So then we moved to the range and duration. So that's a little bit more typical approach for a risk assessment. We know that every task has a duration range, has a minimum and maximum, or most likely depending on what distribution you want to use. Obviously, we wanted to capture most of the COVID impacts, if you will, as risk drivers, so we can really understand their individual impacts and things like that. But there were some changes in long lead equipment. There were some new delivery dates, and there was some variability on those. So we wanted to make sure that we could model those. And in this case, the one you see on the screen, we opted for a better distribution and a percentage variability. So that was fairly easy for the project team to kind of digest and understand. And then that takes us to the simulation, right? I mean, Monte Carlo simulation, nowadays with the computers, you can run 10,000 iterations, 1,000 iterations. It only takes a matter of seconds. So we get results right away. We now know the distribution of the completion dates. Now we know the likelihood of the deterministic dates. So we know how probable meeting the regional target dates are. And we can start, evaluating these strategies, right? We can start presenting results to the client about what's the best path moving forward. But also we just didn't stay there. We wanted to truly understand what was behind those variabilities. So we dive into the criticality index, the sensitivity index, the cruciality index, to really understand what were the drivers of that risk, of that variability. We wanted to understand what's really driving the critical path, what has a correlation to the overall duration. And that way we can better define strategies to kind of minimize the variability on that schedule. Next slide, Dennis, please. And finally, we want to run in multiple scenarios. We really wanted to understand what were the impacts of individual risks. We wanted to understand what was effectiveness of some mitigation items. We wanted to understand what would the curve look like from the one scenario to the next. What would be the curve look like with a new with another site lockdown? What would that variability be? Dennis, you want to move to the next slide, please? So in this case, you can see the curve from one scenario to the next, and you can truly understand what were the drivers behind that. So having that flexibility to really, compare scenarios right next to each other, understand what their variability looked like, and understand what the drivers behind those are, were very important to us. And that's exactly what we needed to do to answer some of the questions that the team had coming into this exercise. Next slide. So now we get into smart decision making, right? So why did we do all this? We went through a process of understanding the plan, recalibrating the plan, factoring uncertainty, qualitative, quantitative, modeling, ranging, winding up scenarios, the whole thing. But what was the ultimate goal? And in our mind, coming in as supporting the project team, what we really wanted to do was to provide the project team, the owner organization, just data, just the insight to make smart decisions. I think coming out of this lockdown, everybody had their own opinion, right? Everybody had like that gut feeling that, we should shoot for this, we should shoot for that, we should recalibrate their plan, or maybe not. We can try to shoot for the original dates, but the reality is that we didn't really have that inside information. We didn't have the data with us. So now with this simulation, with the new model, with the new recalibrated plan, and the results coming out of the risk assessment, now we can finally look at our target dates. In this case, for example, the probability of hitting that fall of 2021 date that Dennis talked about was less than 5%. We model, mitigation strategies. We model, reduced productivity impacts, but trying to be optimistic on the manpower availability and things like that. But the reality is that we were not increasing those chances to more than 10%. So it was still pretty low. So for an owner to really make a decision and invest resources, money, time, effort, to try to bring something back to something that has less than 5%, it's probably not the right approach, especially if you also have that ultimate worry that this thing could happen again. So again, given the high visibility of this project, given the sensitivity of this project for the community, for the city, we wanted to make sure that we made the right decision here. We have the data now to back it up. So, thanks to this effort, we were able to answer some of the questions that we had before. Now we understand the new conditions. We now recognize the risks. We have a strategy to mitigate those risks. We have risk owners. We understand the variability that they bring to the schedule. So finally, we have this kind of updated execution plan. So we talked about recalibrating the schedule. Now we are basically recalibrating an execution plan. And then we can have alignment on stakeholders. We want to make sure that everybody in the team was pulling in the same direction, that the goals were reasonable, the goals were achievable, that they make sense, and we didn't waste time, resources trying to shoot for something that it was probably not going to happen. So it was just kind of like to true up the plan. And again, I just want to emphasize that I think that's something that everybody had in the back of their mind. It's just this effort allowed us to really sink that in and consolidate that strategy. And finally, we as a team, we wanted to make sure that we have a unified message to the rest of the world, right? We wanted to make sure that everybody in the team was on the same page. Everybody in the owners organization was on the same page and communicating. Ultimately, the public, the community were also, part of the process. They felt they understood what the reasons behind those changes were, and also get on board into that new strategy. So that was having that methodic process to engage all the stakeholders and to have that clarity along the way was key to the project. So that brings us to conclusions, right? So, I was thinking about what would be the best way to kind of summarize all this. And in my mind, we as a project managers, we as a project schedulers, planners, project controls folks, we wanted to make sure that we create reliable execution plans, that we engage the right people at the right time and the right level, that we have a true collaboration effort throughout the process, and ultimately that we maintain clarity and that we present clear results to the project team to make smart decisions. So having the ability to leverage tools like NetPoint and NetRisk to facilitate this process, it was key to the success of this effort. Again, we always thought about the possibility of doing this somewhere else, but I don't think any other CPM tool or Excel or anything else would provided us the framework to do this the way we did it. And lastly, we talked about communicate this strategy, right? So we as professionals, we do this analysis, we go through all the data, we run the results, but we want to make sure that we communicate this accordingly to all the stakeholders and the people understand it. So again, these tools, the simplicity, if you will, the visual aspects of NetPoint and the simplicity of NetRisk and the outputs of NetRisk allow us to do that in a very effective way. So that's what made this effort successful.